Great. Shall we close that door a little, then we're not... Thank you. Yeah, but welcome everybody. My name's Jane Clark and I work in DFID. And I actually work in the climate change department, and I have to admit I'm not an urban specialist, but I am always fascinated and interested whenever I hear any of these people talk. So it's my pleasure today to introduce a fantastic panel, of which, one person, Garima, would you like to come and join us? Great, thank you. And we have one of our panelists from the Rockefeller Foundation who is on the screens. But I'll just go along. I would like to introduce Hilary Thornton, who is the Managing Director of Verulam Associates. I think I pronounced that wrongly. Verulam Associates. I could see by the look on your face. Yeah, Aditya Bahadur, who many of you will know, who is a senior research officer here at ODI, and we have on my left Rita Lambert from University of College London, who will be talking to us about some new research from Lima, and Garima, who is from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So, and then on the screens we have Christina at the Rockefeller Foundation. Welcome, and thank you, Christina, for joining us. Okay, DFID are really very interested and committed to looking at urban issues. And it is definitely rising up the agenda after a little kind of a while of people thinking, are they interested, are they not, are they interested? Well, I think we are, and we currently are producing a kind of policy paper which will be soon taken to the new government, where we're looking at kind of about 4 entry points for our own urban work. And all these entry points are in themselves going to need areas for knowledge and learning. And these entry points, just for those who might be interested, are looking at finance for infrastructure. And I notice there's something on the table here in front of me, cities, climate finance for cities. So that looks like really interesting. Improving enabling environments to support cities' competitiveness, because of course we're really interested in poverty, so we're interested in jobs and growth. The links between the formal and informal sectors, and I suspect that today already a lot of this has been covered in different ways. That's and of course links, what we're really interested in as well is links between the urban and the rural, and what about the people who get left behind, and how do we kind of link those and understand those areas together. So all those areas are ripe for the need for more knowledge and learning. We just have one apology today. I'm very sorry to say that Tom Tanner can't join us, but I'd like to thank Aditya, who will be stepping into Tom's shoes. Great, okay, shall we, the first discussion is analysing urban resilience, a reality check for a fledgling canon. Okay, that sounds interesting. And Aditya, would you like to start us off, please?
Thank you. I'll hand over to Hilary to start us off.
Right. I'm going to talk about a piece of research that Aditya and I did together as part of the monitoring of the Asian Climate Change Resilience Network, Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network program, which was supported by Rockefeller. In fact, it's still running, it's still being supported. And our company, Verulam Associates, carried out the monitoring and evaluation of this ACERN program for 5 years, up until 2013. And as part of the study, initially we just monitored the 10 cities that were supported by Rockefeller under the ACERN program in 4 countries in Asia. But after the 3rd year, Rockefeller came to us and they said, well, we're interested in what's happening in the wider field of urban climate change resilience. And because at the moment we're just looking sort of inwards at those cities that we're supporting, what's happening out there in the wider field. So in 2012, we undertook an initial study where Aditya looked at the sort of urban resilience literature, sort of tracing it back from resilience and bringing in some urban and thinking about where that was going. And I complemented that with some empirical research and had researchers in 9 countries in Asia talking to 4 to 6 people at country level, people who were knowledgeable on climate change, government people, urban people, to get a flavour of what countries were doing and where they were as regards climate change and urban issues, and whether they were touching on resilience or what the picture looked like. So that was the first study. And the second study took place in 2013, and that's the one we're going to talk about today. And we decided that for that one, we needed to really focus in a bit more on closer to where the programme was. So looking at the urban climate change resilience literature, which was a fairly small new body of work. And in fact, as Aditya started to look at the articles, found that nearly 75% of them had been published after 2010, so they were only sort of 3 years old, so obviously it was published and grey literature at that point. And we also decided that we knew what countries were saying, what people were saying at country level, but that didn't necessarily speak to the cities. So we wanted to find out what was happening in cities, and very much across Asia, because that's where the programme was based. So we managed to get researchers from 7 countries to go to 13 cities to actually look at and talk to people in those cities. So that the research, the literature, was grounded in the actual what was happening on the ground. So the methods we used were, Aditya eventually managed to sort of get down to about 60 articles that really were speaking to the urban climate change resilience theme. And then there were 66 semi-structured interviews, and these were with the mayor of the city or the chief executive officer of the city, a planner, someone from private sector, civil society, community representatives, really whoever who could get access. But we did manage, I think, to speak to the mayor or the key person in all the cities visited. There were 13 cities which represented coastal cities. In Vietnam, there was Hue, in Bangladesh, Chittagong and Khulna, and in the Philippines, Lipa. Cavite City. Then hill cities in Pakistan, in India, and in that was Philippines as well. And then some plainland cities as well. Some of the cities were very large. Some of the cities were relatively small, although all were growing at a pretty fast rate, as you can imagine from the what's happening. And what we did was we used the initial findings from the urban resilience literature to inform the questionnaire, although we did keep some sort of separation between the two because we didn't want to preclude stuff by saying, that this doesn't really, that these don't fit, this doesn't fit together. So then we sort of analysed for themes from the literature, themes from the empirical research, and then looked at how the two spoke to each other, what were the synergies and what were the differences, and where the gaps were in the literature with regard to what is actually happening on the ground. So what we are going to speak about today is what the literature says, what is the reality in urban areas. Now that sounds very sort of grand to say we are going to talk about the reality in urban areas. We're going to tell you about what people said in the cities the respondents said in the cities, and I think it gives a reasonable picture, but it's 66 people in 13 cities. But, you know, each of those people were spoken to in person. So there is quite a bit of the flavour there from the interviews and from the responses. And then finally, the third point is, what does this mean for the future of research on urban resilience? So over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Hilary. I think Jane's already introduced me, so I just say that I work for the Adaptation and Resilience team at the Overseas Development Institute, and the urban context has become a very big priority for us, and we're doing a number of different projects on urban climate change resilience, aiming to push the boundaries of knowledge further, influence practice, and also influence policy processes. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk more about that in the question and answers. So I think Hilary's laid out what we're going to talk about today very effectively. What we're basically doing is looking at what the literature says, and then seeing what these key informants, policymakers and practitioners in 13 cities told us, to try and determine what we as an urban resilience research community need to do better. Our findings for the next 10 minutes or so of this presentation are in 5 clusters. We focused on issues of governance and decentralization, of knowledge and learning, of preparedness and planning, of looking at how cities can engage with multiple and dynamic shocks and stresses, and also looking at issues of politics and power and how they interact with urban resilience and how they mediate people's capacity to either absorb, anticipate, or adapt to climate-induced shocks and stresses. So the first of these clusters is on governance and decentralization. So I read these 60 papers, and there was one key message coming out of them, that decentralization equals to resilience. That is a gross generalization and a slightly crude way of putting this idea, but that's what the key message was. Papers went on about how increased decentralization equals to greater resilience, how polycentric and flexible institutions can allow cities to deal with different shocks and stresses that are going to hit them. The other big thing on this issue about governance was that most of the discussion on governance for urban resilience was focused on decentralization. So there were these two things, that decentralization is the panacea, and governance with regard to urban resilience is essentially about figuring out how to enhance decentralization.
But in the cities, decentralization, the picture was very mixed. We deliberately chosen countries where our perceived notion of how decentralized they would be. So from places like Philippines and Indonesia, we perceived as being relatively decentralized, especially Philippines, and then those more highly centralized like China and Vietnam. But really, and that did show, there was one city that showed good decentralization, Lipa City in the Philippines, and we could say that was a pretty resilient city as well, so that sort of equated. But then other cities, the picture isn't quite as simple as that, because if you take the cities in South Asian countries, like in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, you've got, in some ways, you've got administrative and political decentralization or devolution. You've got bodies, you've got mayors, you've got people who can make some sort of decisions. But this isn't matched with fiscal decentralization. So they can sit there and they can make some decisions, but then they've got no money to carry their decisions through. So unless you've got fiscal decentralization, all the sort of idealized stuff about how places must be decentralized, there is a big problem there. What was particularly interesting, and we didn't expect, was that in very centralized regimes, like in Suzhou and Kunming in China, they actually were able to make more decisions at city level and to plan better, because they were large cities, but they worked together, made their planning for the city, and then got the ratification from the government, to the central government, who then gave them the money to actually carry out some of the schemes they wanted to carry out. Now, that's quite simplistic, but it did come over that in the centralised systems, they actually had some more autonomy to make decisions than in cities where the sort of decentralisation is rather blurred, because you've got one part of it, i.e. the administrative part, but you haven't got the matching funds to go with that. So that was quite a surprising finding there. Over to you, Aditya, on the next one.
So the second cluster of findings was on knowledge and learning, and all the papers were by and large saying that cities need to learn in order to be more resilient. Now, the thing is that a lot of the literature on how cities need to be learned is fairly prescriptive and talks about quite sort of sophisticated models of learning that are out of touch with what's really happening in cities in the developing world. There are models on shared learning, how different departments doing different functions need to come together and make decisions collaboratively. There's a great emphasis on learning continually, even before shocks hit the city, and then, of course, learning from shocks and bouncing back better. And there are ideas such as conscientization that spring from sort of Paulo Freire's ideas of empowerment and awareness, that talks about how communities in cities and policymakers and practitioners need to develop a critical awareness of the power structures that surround them and navigate these in order to really attack the drivers of their vulnerability.
But the pictures from the cities was very, very different from that picture, and there was very little evidence of cities learning from experience. I mean, if we take one of the cities, Mingora in Pakistan, one of the respondents said the perceptions have not changed, even though we have been hit with all sorts of shocks, like from extremism to floods. And they basically had not really learnt for those and just almost waiting for the next disaster to happen, and then were very reactive and would deal with that when it actually happened. And I think overall, they were highly reactive to the shocks, and they took action when disasters struck. There was some reflection in that, putting in early warning systems and things like that, but not the sort of degree of deep shared reflection that is coming out of the literature. And one of the second key point really was that dealing with everyday life and just surviving in cities like, say, Khulna, Chittagong, where there's constant influx of new people, that's putting pressure on services. They've got so many people. A city that was built for 20,000 now has hundreds of thousands of people, and there just isn't the time to learn, and that reflection really in that sort of situation where you're just trying to survive and trying to get by and get things happening is really quite a luxury.
The third set of findings was on preparedness and planning, and of course a lot of the literature talks about how cities can plan better for enhancing urban resilience, but the broad headline message from this is that master plans, city development plans, and urban sectoral development plans provide an effective entry point for mainstreaming risk reduction and thereby reducing risk and building resilience systemically.
And from the cities, there was good planning evident from the two ends of the spectrum, particularly Lipa City in Philippines and the cities in China. But other cities, there were plans, but they had been conceived 10, 20 years ago, and they really were archaic and they weren't being put into practice. And one of the key issues was that, another key issue was that planning wasn't just for the city, it was for the state and for the province as well to have a say in the city's planning. So it just was not that simple and couldn't be carried out by the city alone.
The fourth set of findings was around how the literature talks about that cities, to become resilient, need to engage with multiple and dynamic shocks and stresses. The literature that talks about cities engaging with climate impacts also emphasizes that cities need to deal with more than only climate impacts. You need to look at demographic shifts, migration, the risk of technological and man-made disasters, in order to also enhance the city's ability to become more resilient to climate change. The literature also emphasizes how cities need to simultaneously engage with shocks as well as stresses.
And from the cities, there was a big separation. Shocks and stresses were two completely different things. Shocks, often climate related, they had mechanisms to deal with. They were reactive, but they could bring in the army, they could bring in the fire services, the national people. They would come and resource and help them when there was a shock. But stresses were gradually ongoing. Things like drainage, pollution, things that needed long-term planning. They just were not being dealt with, and in some ways they just became part of the fabric of how we manage in the city. We have stresses, we just deal with them in the best way we can.
The final set of findings was around politics and power, and it's a bit embarrassing talking about this when David is sitting in the audience. He's actually the visionary forerunner of this strain of research. So a lot of the literature talked about, now has started talking about, sorry, let me rephrase that. A small subset of the literature has started talking about the importance of politics and power to building resilience. This is about engaging with issues of caste, class, gender relations, organizational cultures, interpersonal politics, and acknowledging that all these have a critical bearing on the manner in which a city can become more resilient to climate change.
And in some ways I'd like to illustrate one of the ways in which politics was evident in the research that we carried out by just illustrating what was happening in two cities in one country, and that was the Philippines. In one city, Lipa, the mayor had the interest of the citizens at heart. He wanted to build a safe city and a city that people wanted to come to. Even though there were people, the city was expanding, he looked on that as a positive thing, with more jobs, more people taking up educational provision, and in some ways moving towards resilience. In Cavite City, by contrast, the mayor was he was giving into pressure from the fishermen and capturing the vote from the fishermen, so that he was actually colluding with one particular group, which was not in the best benefits of the city. So two politicians, sort of to the first point, that politicians are very important in enabling or constraining resilience. The other thing that we found very much is that the marginalised, there is very little voice of the marginalised coming out of the cities. And even in cities that seem to be operating very well, you suddenly realise that the people who've migrated in, say in the cities in China, where they say, oh yes, we look after everyone, those people actually don't have representation because they aren't citizens, because they have migrated in. So they're not having a voice, and therefore what we did find that was on this point, that very much there was a convergence with the empirical findings and the literature. So over to Aditya for the final messages.
Thanks, Hilary. So there you have sort of 5 clusters of findings from the literature and 5 sets of reality checks from discussions with people actually living in the cities and in the developing world. So where does this leave us with regard to the future direction of research for urban resilience? So here I present to you 5 key messages on possible future directions for urban resilience. So we learned about how the literature talks about the relationship between resilience and decentralization fairly unproblematically, whereas the reality is slightly different, where fiscal, financial, administrative, and political decentralizations need to be considered slightly differently and need to align in order for a city to become more resilient. So on the whole, there is a great need for future research on urbanization to acknowledge this nuance and deal with this level of complexity. Then we learnt about how the literature has fairly sophisticated assumptions on how cities should learn and prepare for shocks before and learn from shocks and bounce back better after shocks. But the reality was that cities are sort of lurching from emergency to emergency in a highly reactive mode of functioning. And some of these ideas of reflective learning out of touch with what is really possible in cities. So we need more emphasis on looking at models that will work in cities in the South. Then we looked at how the literature talks about city development plans, master planning processes, and sectoral development plans as sort of valuable avenues for mainstreaming risk reduction and resilience, but found that even in cities where these planning processes are underway, plans are not in force and are gathering dust on some shelf in a municipal office, and therefore we need to really look at pathways of instituting risk reduction and resilience in informal ways beyond formal planning regimes. Is perhaps talking to bricklayers and masons in second tier and third tier cities in India a more valuable investment of time and money than ensuring that you have absolutely robust building codes that are never enforced? Those are the kind of questions that researchers need to be answering. We found the literature unproblematically couples shocks and stresses, whereas cities treat them very differently. Financial incentives for dealing with shocks and stresses are quite different. In fact, sometimes there are disincentives for dealing with stresses, because the federal government may unlock a stream of emergency funding when a shock hits the city, whereas no such funding stream exists for stresses. This is again the level of complexity that urban resilience researchers need to engage with. We found a convergence in the emerging strand of literature on the importance of politics and power, and we think this is great, and we think more of this needs to happen, and it needs to become much more than only a subset. Apart from these 5 key directions, I think there are a couple of strategic directions that we need to take. Urban resilience researchers need to look at other disciplines, both drawing on sociological concepts of autonomy and agency, temper some of this obsession with talking about decentralization, won't talking about informal learning, drawing on psychological and education literature, really give a more realistic perspective on how cities can learn. Informal learning, of course, places sort of the individual at the center of the learning exercise, as opposed to talking about exogenous learning frameworks that can be transplanted into contexts. This apart, I think there's a geographic direction where urban resilience research needs to travel. A lot of it is about beautiful cities in Sweden and Netherlands, and not enough about poorly planned, badly governed cities in the developing world. And therefore we see some of these mismatches in what the literature is saying and the reality of cities in the developing world. So that is the pith of a long paper that is now being published in the International Journal of Urban Sustainable Development. Cheap plug here for the paper, which will appear later in this month. So very happy for you to ask me to forward it to you when it's out. And of course, over back to the chair.
Great. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Aditya and Hilary. I found that fascinating. And it resonates with a lot of things that we've been thinking about in DFID about learning. And we've got a little catchphrase, and I think it sums up your work well, that it's connections and not just collections of things that sit on shelves collecting dust, which can actually really make a difference. And I really like the way that you've made this connection between the theoretical literature and what you had, the conversations that you had on the ground.